James Paterson. I want to ask you about something else that Labor announced today, not so much their talk about union governance. I'm interested, decoupled from that, in their suggestion that they would like to see disclosure provisions for political donations drop down to $1,000 from the current position of $13,000. I'm torn on this as a political scientist, I suppose, if you like. On the one hand, I like the idea of full disclosure, for disclosure's sake almost, but at the same time, I feel like people have a right to do what they will with their money when donating without necessarily being tarred and feathered in an overly partisan political structure, particularly businesses. What are your thoughts?
I completely agree, Peter. And look, it was a bit of a sloppy attempt by Labor to link in some way, cracking down on union corruption and misuse of members' funds with a quid pro quo on Liberal Party donors. I mean, if the Labor Party is really sincere about acting in the best interest of workers, then they should support any means that get unions back on the straight and narrow.
I should clarify though, James, I should clarify, I said that I understood that the two were coupled. I'm informed, reliably informed by the opposition that they are not, but what that essentially means is that there will be no change to the provisions around donations, doesn't it?
It does, and I think there is not a very strong case for making those changes. I think $13,000 is already a pretty low threshold. I'd be really surprised if you could buy much underhanded influence for less than $13,000 on a political party. The reality is that the donations above $13,000 that are disclosed, we haven't had a political donation scandal in Australia that's demonstrated that there was a donation made to a political party and favourable consideration was given to a donor. So if it's not happening above $13,000, I'd be deeply shocked if it's happening below it. And you're absolutely right, particularly when we see the kind of intimidation that's been happening with John Setka and the CFMEU here in Victoria towards Boral. Just imagine what that kind of intimidation would be for a small or medium-sized business that was declared to have made a donation to the Liberal Party. They'd be having some real tough time with their union reps and members, I suspect.
Matt Burney, you're a former Liberal Party leader over there in WA. I mean, talk us through the apprehension that might exist for some people when donating to either side of politics because it is going to be disclosed. I mean, is that something that really does make it tough for parties to raise money, or is it just a simple case of, well, the public has a right to know where people's money goes?
Look, Peter, I live in this sort of utopia world that says that one day we might have just full, adequate public funding for elections whereby the taxpayer funds the election in
James
total.
Paterson's not going to agree with you about that.
And you don't have to go out and rattle the tin and beg, borrow money from people who otherwise may or may not donate. Whether we've got part public funding now, but whether we'll get to full public funding or not, I don't know. I think we should. With respect to the issue of the lowering of the $13,000 threshold to the $1,000 threshold, I think James did touch on a pretty good point, and that is that it's really, really rare in this country that you see actual examples of corruption where somebody has donated money to a particular political candidate or a particular political party, and in return that candidate or party has done something favourable. I don't think we have that problem necessarily in Australia, and I think the 13,000 threshold is probably appropriate simply because there are a lot of people who have either Conservative views or Labor views, as the case may be, and they want to contribute financially, and they're able to contribute financially to the public debate, but they don't want to be named as a Liberal Party person or a Labor Party person, and I think that 13,000 threshold is probably appropriate with regard to that argument.
James Paterson, an ex-Liberal leader there, advocating full public funding of elections. What is going on in the world?
Oh, that's a great question, Peter. I have no idea. Look, I won't list all the reasons why 100% public funding of political parties is such a terrible idea, but just one to consider that is a bit unconventional and from a democratic point of view is really concerning. If you have 100% funding of political parties, that is a massive, massive advantage to incumbent political parties. It will further entrench incumbent political parties because what they do in to an election, the federal director of the Liberal Party and the Labor Party is able to go to one of the major banks and say, you can make a reasonable estimation about the primary vote we're going to get at the election, and we're going to get X number of dollars of funding for every vote that we get. So loan us that money up front, and we'll spend that on our campaign on
James,
advertising.
There's a lot of
party could ever do that.
I know there's a lot of other arguments you have, but I don't concur with a lot of them. But that is one that does worry me. The idea of incumbents being so benefiting so much. But other than that, I can see the point that Matt Burney's trying to make. But let me ask a quick one, a personal question for you, James Paterson. I hear on the rumour mill that you might be considering a run for the Senate for the Liberal Party. Any truth in that?
Well, there's no vacancy to run for, Peter, so...
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet is my answer.
All right, fair enough. Matt Burney, and as an ex-politician, your advice for Mr Paterson if he does decide to run for Parliament?
Oh, look, the upper house tends to be pretty boring, if you ask me. I'm not sure that's a wonderful place of work to be in every day of your life.
They're never as bad as state upper houses. Never as bad as state upper houses. Let's be honest.
Peter would strongly disagree with that. Somebody's got
exciting.
a PhD thesis on the Senate.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. But I didn't have to serve in it, but I did have to talk to a lot of them for it, which, in a sense, put me in the same category that Matt Burney's talking about. Sorry, Matt, you were saying?
One thing I would say, if you're going to run for the Senate, then largely the burden of raising money has been lifted from your shoulders, James. If you're going to run for the lower house, you'll be spending probably 30 to 40% of your campaign time talking to people about donating money to you, and that's time you'll never get back again.
I don't know. What can I say, Matt? Fundraising is not something I'm afraid of. I do it every day at the IPA. We're 100% funded by voluntary donations, and we raise about $3 million every year to keep doing what we're doing.
James Paterson, I'd love you to take me through who donates, but I've tried that one with a certain Tim Wilson when he worked for the IPA some time ago. Never with much luck, but I'm not sure who I feel more sorry for out of upper and lower house MPs. Lower house MPs have to run around scratching for money. Upper house MPs have to talk to party members. It's a difficult situation between the two. Before we run out of time, though, let's move to another topic area. I mentioned that I didn't really want to go too much into this, but just a quick thought from each of you. Start with you, Matt Burney, if I can, on the issue of union governance changes that Bill Shorten announced today. Is it something that you see the government meeting him on? Do you see this as chutzpah on steroids, given what's been going on with the Royal Commission and so forth? Your view?
Look, it's too little too late, obviously, and I think Bill Shorten sees that he's pretty much under the whip with respect to the Union Royal Commission, and who could forget, former High Court judge heading up the Royal Commission said publicly that the alternate Prime Minister of Australia has a credibility problem, and I think this is really just a ploy to try and claw back a little bit of that credibility that went out the window when he sat in that witness box. Look, bring back the ABCC. That's really how you deal with union thuggery and all of the things that go along with that union thuggery. You need a body that is agile and mobile and able to deal with issues as they come up. And that is clearly the ABCC.
There's that word again, agile. Look, let's move on to another topic area. This will be our last because we will run out of time. But James Paterson, Ian MacFarlane. Isn't this all of your lot's fault down there in Victoria for enticing Julian McGorran across from the Nationals to the Liberal Party a few years back? And voila, here we are a few years later and the National Party are instituting payback to the Liberal Party.
Yes, although it's pretty different circumstances, Peter, given that the Queensland LNP are merged, and Julian McGorran wasn't enticed by the possibility of returning to the front bench and didn't move over because he'd been dumped from the front bench, and there was no accusation of sour grapes involved. It was just that Julian had a change of heart philosophically
and moved to the Liberal Party. Didn't he get himself a better spot on the ticket as a result of leaving the Nationals and going to the Libs, but it just didn't end up working out for him anyway because of the election result?
Well, arguably it was worse. He ended up on the third spot of the ticket and then lost that spot. So, no, I don't think there's any personal political advantage for Julian involved. He just had a sincere philosophical change of heart. I don't think that anyone would argue that that's what's happened in the case of Ian MacFarlane. I think that seems surprisingly well-timed with his demotion from the front bench. So I suspect that's the biggest motivator there.
I suspect you are exactly right on that one. We're going to talk actually tomorrow and to the point with Christina Keneally to Peter McGorran, Julian McGorran's brother. He is now a member of the Liberal Party too, but he didn't make the change while still in Parliament. Matt Burney, quick one from you. Over there in WA, we know that the Nats and the Liberals all but hate each other. What do you think of Ian MacFarlane's shift?
Look, I guess there's a few issues at play here. Firstly, political parties tend to get pretty mean and nasty about former members who defect to other political parties, and so I think Ian can probably expect that some of his former colleagues aren't quite as friendly these days as perhaps they were prior to him defecting. But it also raises an interesting question, and that is that does that additional member of the National Party mean that the National Party will in fact get another member of Cabinet? I don't think the maths quite adds up to that fourth, or whatever the number is, that additional member of Cabinet. But having said that, from Ian MacFarlane's point of view, he can certainly represent his electorate a whole lot better if he's a minister than a backbencher. So there are lots of issues at play here. I'm not sure that he'll become a minister via the National Party gateway.
Gentlemen,
though.
we're out of time, but here we are again, a quota system for the National Party when it comes to the front bench, but no quota system for women based on gender. Can one of you get even close to showing me some consistency on the right of politics
Peter?
when it comes to quotas?
For the record, I'm against quotas for anyone under any circumstances, including Nationals and perhaps especially Nationals.
That's consistent. Very quickly, Matt Burney, your view?
Peter, my view when I was running the Liberal Party and my view now is that we shouldn't be in an automatic coalition with the National Party. If we need their votes to govern after an election, then we should do a deal to govern, and as part of that deal, we would probably have to put some kind of a quota in place depending on who had how many members in the Parliament. I think it's a very separate matter to female quotas and those sorts of things, but for my money, we don't need to be in coalition unless we need their numbers. At that point in time, they'll need our numbers as well, and we would then form a coalition.
Yeah, I think that's
but we would all go into the election as separate parties would be the ideal situation from my perspective.
Yep, I think that's consistent, but not when you're in a formal coalition forever and a day. Then the quota comparison, I think, makes sense. Gentlemen, we're out of time. Matt Burney as well as James Paterson, who may well be running for the Senate if and when there is a vacancy. Gentlemen, thanks for your company. See you again next week.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, guys.